In 2004, a young man named Mohan lived in the ancient city of Agra. He and his friends shared that typical teenage sense of invincibility, spending most of their nights wandering far from home. They actively sought out the most isolated, desolate locations they could find. They wanted privacy, a place to escape the watchful eyes of their parents and neighbors, where they could hang out completely undisturbed. One night, around 1 a.m., the sky filled with dry lightning. There was no rain, only the silent flashes of an approaching thunderstorm. Wanting to get home, Mohan decided to take a late-night shortcut through a local cremation ground. In doing so, he crossed a profound ancient boundary. A shmashan is a sacred space belonging entirely to the dead, and treating it as a casual convenience invites severe consequences. Deep inside the grounds, Mohan felt suddenly thirsty. He walked to an iron hand pump sitting in the dirt and began pumping it. The loud metallic clanking echoed outward across the silent, unlit graves. The noise drew something out from the darkness. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated a terrifying figure walking directly toward him. The man was smeared in white ash, derived from human remains, and wore a heavy necklace of bones around his throat. Mohan stepped back to leave, but the situation escalated instantly. He was suddenly surrounded by 13 towering, deformed figures. Among them stood a massive, heavily built entity staring down at him with bulging, blood-red eyes. The massive entity grabbed Mohan's arm with bone-chilling strength. Smiling, he produced a hollowed-out human skull filled with dark liquor and forced the terrified boy to drink it, calling it a dark offering. By taking the liquid into his body, Mohan invited the entity across the final threshold. He had ingested the offering, allowing the attachment to move from the shadows of the graveyard into his own blood and marrow. The moment Mohan returned home, the biological anomalies began. Despite having a lifelong, intense aversion to milk, he walked into the kitchen in a trance-like state and violently chugged 2 entire liters in a single breath. That was the start of an aggressive incubation period. Over the next 7 days, Mohan physically wasted away into a living skeleton. He completely stopped eating and drinking, yet every blood test and medical scan run by the hospital came back perfectly normal. As the doctors struggled to find a diagnosis, Mohan's psychological state collapsed. He lay paralyzed in his bed, deeply terrified, as his subconscious mind forced his own bodily organs to systematically shut down. The intravenous drips and prescription drugs were completely useless. The doctors were trying to treat a biological failure, entirely unaware that a paranormal entity was consuming their patient's life force from the inside. Desperate to break him out of his silence, Mohan's parents brought his cousin Vishal over to stay the night in his room. They hoped a familiar face would help, but Vishal ended up becoming an objective witness to the horror. At midnight, both boys were jolted awake. A delicate, terrifying sound echoed into the dark bedroom from the outside balcony. It was the distinct clinking of glass bangles and heavy metal anklets. Mohan was entirely paralyzed by dread, unable to move a muscle. Realizing his cousin couldn't get up, Vishal gathered his courage, slipped out of bed, and walked toward the glass doors to investigate the noise. He opened the door, stepped out, and looked up. A woman was hanging completely upside down from the concrete roof. She had 5-foot-long, matted hair dangling toward the floor. Her limbs were mangled, and her arms were covered in the heavy red bangles that were making the clinking noise. Vishal immediately fled the house. The supernatural threat had now expanded its radius, moving from an internal infection destroying Mohan into a physical entity actively endangering the entire household. Mohan's father finally stepped in and brought their family's Gurudev to the house. The situation shifted immediately from blind panic to a cold, clinical occult diagnosis. The Gurudev sat with Mohan, observing the rapid decay of his body and a lingering scent of the graveyard. He realized that the woman Vishal saw on the balcony was one of 2 witches working in tandem with the entity from the cremation ground to claim the boy. The entities were exhausting Mohan's body until it could no longer hold his spirit. Once he withered away, they would claim his soul, dragging it back to the Shmashan to be bound as a permanent servant for the figures he met that night. Saving Mohan required an immediate exorcism. The Gurudev needed to physically rip the deadly curse out of the boy and transfer it into a surrogate vessel before the boy's body finally gave out. On the moonless night of Amavasya, the Gurudev performed the extraction ritual. He transferred the dark energy into a black clay pot filled with specific occult items, including local liquor, a coconut, and red bangles. He then handed the cursed pot to Mohan's father, outlining a strict set of rules. The father had to carry the vessel to a desolate crossroad exactly at 1 a.m., drop it, and walk back home without ever turning around to look behind him. But as his father stepped out into the night, the small clay pot began to gain unnatural weight. With every step he took toward the crossing, the mass inside the vessel compounded. Halfway there, his hands were violently trembling, struggling to hold what now felt exactly like carrying a heavy 80-kilogram dead human corpse. Pushing through the agonizing strain, the father reached the crossroad, dropped the vessel, and completed the unbroken walk back to his front door. Mohan's fever broke, and his survival was finally secured. While our modern world often feels totally insulated and safe, ancient boundaries still exist in the dark. Crossing them for a momentary convenience can invite unimaginable horrors, forcing this family in Agra to maintain a lifelong vow of silence about the night they nearly lost their son.